Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the channel. Today we're going to do, I think, something really fun. We're going to do a deep dive into Jonathan Edwards' grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. Now, maybe you have not heard much about Solomon Stoddard before, but I'm going to fill you in on all the major pieces of that incredible story right here in this video. And by the way, I am going to put this in our Jonathan Edwards playlist, which we have on my channel. All things Jonathan Edwards. I have so much content about Edwards. And by the way, while we're talking about Edwards for just a minute before we get into his grandfather, I want to invite you to my Jonathan Edwards class at RPTS. I'll be teaching a class. It's just a Friday night and a Saturday. It's really just a one-credit opportunity. Maybe if you want to dip your toe into the seminary waters, this would be a great class to get started on that. You can just call RPTS right there in Pittsburgh, and you can get signed up for that class. I think that'd be something really cool. And while we're still on Edwards, I do want to mention my book, A Theology of Joy, which was essentially my dissertation on Jonathan Edwards that I wrote while I was studying for my doctoral degree. Ended up turning it into a book, and I added a bunch of other chapters at the end about Jonathan Edwards, his life, his ministry, his influence. So if you're looking for some Edwardsian stuff, then go grab this book right here, A Theology of Joy. It'll be a good introduction to who Jonathan Edwards is and what he was like. All right. Well, that all being said, let's get into a deep dive in the life of Solomon Stoddard here. Now, this is an AI picture. It's not an actual portrait of him. I was a little bit confused whether or not there is any portraits of Solomon Stoddard extant. I don't think there is. There's a few. If you look for it online, you'll find a couple, but usually they're misappropriated to another person. Sometimes they confuse a picture of Cotton Mather with Solomon Stoddard. I'm not sure why they did that or how that confusion got going, but if you see one with a wig, it's definitely not Solomon Stoddard, because this is one of the interesting things about Solomon Stoddard is that he despised the powdered wigs, and so he totally got rid of that, at least for himself. He thought that was all pretense. He thought it was pomp. He thought it was flair. He thought it was unnecessary. And so Solomon Stoddard, if you ever see him with a wig, it's definitely not our guy here. Well, he is the second pastor of Northampton, which is the church that Jonathan Edwards would eventually pastor as well. And we're going to get to that story as we go here. It's very interesting how he became the second pastor of the Northampton church. But let's start off with just a little bit about his background here. So his dates are September 27th, 1643. Now, just to frame that up in context here, that's about the time of the Westminster Assembly. So we're talking, I mean, this is going back a ways, isn't it? Lives all the way into the 1720s. 1729 is his death. And he was, as you might expect, baptized on October 1st of 1643 at the First Church in Boston. Okay, so he's not an original person from England. He is here a colonist of the Americas. We might think of him as an American then, and a unique American theologian in his own right. Interestingly, as to his biography, his mother died when he was just an infant, and we can only imagine what effect that would have on his personality, his person, his manner, his way of life. Sometimes when a child's parents die when they're young, it puts them into the crucible of trials and tribulations in life. Sometimes that produces greatness. Other times it produces despair and even disaster. In this case, I think it produced greatness. He was, interestingly, one of the first librarians here in the Americas, or the colonies. In fact, he was the librarian for Harvard, the first on the register. And so, in some sense, we do consider him the father of library sciences here in America, which is interesting in its own right. He went to Harvard in 1662, graduating there. Again, that's really early here. That's before the Salem witch trials in the 1690s. So I just think this era is incredibly interesting. Now, like most of his time, he would have studied the languages even from the time he was very small. So we know that he studied Latin. He gained quite a bit of mastery over Latin. He would have also studied Greek and Hebrew, the biblical languages, I would imagine. And as I mentioned, he served as Harvard's first librarian in 1667. And this is interesting, too. He ended up being a chaplain to Barbados, believe it or not. And I just think that's incredibly interesting. Chaplain to Barbados only lasted a couple of years, though, because then something significant happened in his life, and that is that he ended up getting a call to be the pastor of the Northampton church. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. So, and I'll explain the chart here in just a moment, I promise. He marries a person called Esther Mather Stoddard, right? And you'll notice the name Mather there because that's one of the most famous names of colonial pastoral theological history here in the colonies. We think of Richard Mather, Increase Mather, Cotton Mather, etc. And yes, that is the family that he married into. But here's where it gets really curious. Okay, so Esther Mather was the first wife of Eleazar Mather. Now, try not to be confused here. Again, I'll show you a chart in here in just a moment. But Eleazar Mather, the pastor of the Northampton church, when he died, not only did this church, Northampton, call Solomon Stoddard to be their new pastor, but within a few months of him coming to be the pastor, two things which you think are, this is crazy. First, he moved into Eleazar Mather's house. And second, he ended up marrying the widow of Eleazar Mather. So this woman, Esther, was married to the first pastor of the church. When he dies, they call a new pastor. He comes, moves into the parsonage or the house or whatever, and then all of a sudden they fall in love and he marries her. And so this woman has a marriage to both pastors, of course, totally biblically legitimate. The first one died. And I think it's curious that Solomon Stoddard is now living in the house of his predecessor and then marries the widow. It's just amazing. Now, together, they'll end up having 13 children total. One of them dies. 3 of them are stepchildren from Eleazar and Esther's first marriage. And so Solomon Stoddard, like many people throughout history, is a stepfather of 3 by the time he marries. He's already got 3 children because she has 3 from the deceased. And then they end up having a lot more children, and only one of them dies. That's pretty unique that only one died in infancy, because what I've read is that in the colonial period at about this time, most families would have between 6 and 9 children, but very often there was multiple children that would have been stillbirths or died in infancy. I'm sorry, as painful as that is to say. Sometimes children would die at a very young age, and so to have them actually live into their teenage years and beyond is a pretty marvelous and wonderful thing. Now, about this time, I should pause and cite my scholarly sources, because I don't know all this stuff just off the top of my head. I'm just not pulling this out of the Wikipedia of my own brain, but I'm using scholarly sources here. The 2 that I've really depended on for the making of this presentation are, number 1, George Marsden's incredible biography of the life of Jonathan Edwards. Okay, there's a lot about Edwards' background, including a lot of material for Solomon Stoddard. And believe it or not, I was combing through that material looking for information for my Edwards course that I mentioned earlier with RPTS. And I decided, you know what, I think I'm going to do a whole lecture on Solomon Stoddard. There was enough there that was just interesting enough that I wanted to do a deep dive. And then secondly, I did use Joel Beeke's book, Meet the Puritans, which has about 10, 12, 15 page introductions to many, many, many of the Puritans, including a nice little setup on Solomon Stoddard. So anyway, that's where I got my source material from in this particular lecture. Now here's that relationship, because I always get this confused, so I thought I'd just put this out on a chart here. And by the way, let me just kind of move my picture out of the way. There we go. So Richard Mather, 1569 to 1669, he is the patriarch of this particular family. And among his children, there are 2 that we want to point out here. The first is Increase Mather, 1605 to 1781. He's probably pretty famous for his role in the Salem witch trials. And Increase Mather is the father of Cotton Mather, okay, so 1663 to 1728. Now, go back up a generation. Increase Mather's brother is Eleazar, okay, so these 2 are brothers. Can you see that? And I guess my pointer arrow isn't currently showing right now, but Increase and Eleazar, they're brothers. It's Eleazar who marries the wife Esther. Warham was her maiden name. He dies in 1669. Esther then marries Solomon Stoddard. They marry in 1670 the next year. They have many children, as I mentioned, one of whom is Esther Stoddard. So we got multiple Esthers here, confusing enough as this chart is. And Esther is going to marry one Timothy Edwards. These would be Jonathan Edwards' parents, okay? And so we have ministers all over the place. Practically every name on this chart is a pastor, either from the Mathers family, the Stoddard family, or eventually the Edwards family. So all these people are actually related together, and that, I think, is interesting in its own right. Now, where is all of this happening? Well, Northampton, Massachusetts. So let's have a look at the map here. Northampton. Oh, my arrow's back. That's great. So here's Northampton right here, and here over here is Boston. Now, Boston is where all of the action is taking place back in these days. This is where the Mathers reside. So Increase and Cotton Mather, their influence is wielded here. Boston is one of the most important cities, and so Northampton, actually, this is considered kind of frontier territory, believe it or not. I mean, it seems like it's only a few miles in, up, what is that, 50 or 90 west there. But in those days, this was kind of out there a little bit in the, on the frontier territory. And so Solomon Stoddard taking this call, he's going to be something like the champion of Western Massachusetts. And believe it or not, there's going to be sort of an East Coast, West Coast rivalry. That's not the West Coast, but you get it. There's a rivalry in terms of political influence, theological influence, and for some respect, these guys are allies, the Mathers and the Stoddards, but they're also rivals in another sense, and we'll talk a little bit more about that rivalry as we go. Now, Solomon Stoddard, I think everybody would say that his influence was absolutely huge in this time. So late 1600s, early 1700s is our time frame. In fact, he was one of what they called, and please forgive the inappropriateness of this title, the Connecticut River Gods. And we should have a lowercase g there, but this is in all caps. The Connecticut River Gods was sort of a nickname that they gave to Solomon Stoddard and William Williams and a few other very influential persons in that western area, that Northampton, Connecticut River Valley area that I just showed you. His influence is hard to overestimate because Solomon Stoddard was extremely significant in his time. Now, he would go annually and deliver a major sermon in the city of Boston. He was essentially the spokesman for what we would consider Western Massachusetts today. And there's no doubt that amongst the theologians of his time, he is the most noted pastor scholar, again with that sort of creative tension with the Mathers family on the East Coast there. Towering person in both presence and mind. That's interesting because whenever people discuss firsthand accounts of Solomon Stoddard, they think of him as a very towering, sort of imposing person, a stern, and probably even more so because he was a physically large person, but also extremely sharp. Intellectually, mentally, and sometimes when you put that combination together, you have a rather imposing force. If you've ever met anybody who walks into the room and they instantly dominate the attention of the room and they sort of control people even without trying to do so, they're just kind of persons that wield a lot of influence. That's what we're talking about here. And Solomon Stoddard was noted for being a fierce preacher with, again, a very, very sharp intellect in the pulpit. Now, there's another reason that Solomon Stoddard has a ton of influence here in these early days, and that would be because Solomon Stoddard has a son who's called Colonel John Stoddard. And Colonel John Stoddard, he was one of the most significant landowners of that time. He was also a magistrate. He was also elected to representation multiple times. He's also a military commander, thus the name Colonel John Stoddard, and very often going over to Boston to represent, again, this western area of Massachusetts. John Stoddard alone is sort of the military political protector of the entire Northampton area. He has a great biography himself, and maybe we'll have to do another video on John Stoddard's influence at some point. But nevertheless, Solomon Stoddard wields his influence also through his son, who is this military sort of political presence. Now, Stoddard, and one of the reasons I like him, there's a couple of reasons I don't, which I'll go into momentarily, but he's essentially Presbyterian-minded in a world of Congregationalists. And he was trying to set up what we might think of as a proto-presbytery in his day. And so some of his opponents disparagingly called him the Pope of Connecticut Valley because in those times, those who held to very strict Congregationalist forms of governments, they were very, very suspicious of anything that looked like a presbytery. In their minds, that was almost getting into prelacy or bishoprics, and by the time you're there, you're talking Anglican, even Roman Catholic influence. They did not like that, so they mocked him as being the Pope of the Connecticut Valley. But Solomon Stoddard's real goal was to set up something like one of the Scottish presbyteries, which he thought was an ideal biblical form of church government. And so he's going to start this thing called the Hampshire Association, which Jonathan Edwards is going to be heavily involved in his own time. Unfortunately, and here's a critique, Solomon Stoddard lets the office of the ruling elder die out. Now, there was ruling elders in the Northampton church, but ironically, the last ruling elder died on the same day that Solomon Stoddard died. And so by the time Edwards becomes the primary sole pastor of the Northampton church, the office of ruling elder had gone out of vogue, and essentially they only had deacons left. So while we can credit Solomon Stoddard for acting Presbyterian and starting a presbytery, he's also not, in the sense that he doesn't really think very highly of the role of ruling elder, and that's probably because he has sort of like a subtext elitism, where he truly does believe that pastor should be the controlling influence in the town and in society at large. Now, more to that same point, he has one son who is a pastor, as well as 5 sons-in-law amongst the clergy. And so not only do we mention his influence by the extension of Colonel Stoddard, but also his son and 5 sons-in-law are pastors also in that area, and they all look to Solomon Stoddard for their cues as to what to do and how to act and respond to certain tensions. Now, here's just a beautiful little picture, a painting of the Connecticut River Valley, and again, he's called one of the Connecticut River Valley gods, lowercase g, because of his amazing influence here. A little bit more about the Hampshire Association. This is another thing that I just think is kind of interesting. Took some notes on it as I was reading about Edwards. He begins to found this thing in 1714, and they would meet twice a year, April and October. If you're Presbyterian, you probably meet more than that. My presbytery meets 4 times a year. Others meet 3 times a year. This one met twice. It was advisory only, and so it didn't technically have the same kind of power, control, influence that we might say a regular presbytery would. It only had the power to advise, okay? And so that would actually get into some trouble a couple times. And the churches that were part of the Hampshire Association, those would be Northampton, Suffield, Springfield, Sunderland, Hatfield, Westfield, Hadley. I guess Sunderland is on there twice. Nope, Deerfield, Enfield, Longmeadow, and Northfield. Those would be the churches that participated in this. It was ostensibly to unite the clergy, to make sure to preserve Reformed orthodoxy as over against Anglicanism or Arminianism or deism or any of the other threats, as well as to evangelize the heathen, which is something that Solomon Stoddard was very keen to make possible. 1732, this is after he dies, subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith or an equivalent would end up being required for participation in the Hampshire Association, and that again is to keep out Arminians and Arians and deists and other such things. Now, if we're looking at that map again, this would be your picture of the Hampshire Association that he gets started, and you can see here that these churches basically go right up and down the Connecticut River here, with Northampton being right in the center. So this is why Solomon Stoddard loves this position, and you can see his influence in recruiting these churches to participate in the Hampshire Association, of which Jonathan Edwards will eventually become a part himself. Now, as to his controversies, probably the biggest controversy that Solomon Stoddard has is the communion controversy, and Edwards is going to work hard to revert back to the original position here, but what happened first? Well, the halfway covenant was this kind of a confusing moment where, the first generation of believers is very ardent, and so they are baptized themselves, and church members, they have participation in the Lord's Supper. But then you run into this problem of you've baptized your children, but what if they don't become Lord's Supper communicant members? In the third generation, then, you run into this real problem of you've baptized your children, they haven't become church members, can their children be baptized? And this is where you run into a real kind of ecclesiastical problem. Well, Solomon Stoddard would say in the halfway covenant that yes, the children of baptized individuals can also be baptized, even if that middle generation had not fully joined the church as a communicant member. In those days, in my view, maybe a little bit too restrictive as to who they would allow to participate in the Lord's Supper. They had to give a testimony in which they were able to identify several steps of the Lord working in their lives. And if there was testimony wasn't right, they weren't received into membership. It became very controversial. Stoddard wants to, for lack of a better term here, open up the table then to a broader panoply of participants. He wants more people coming to the Lord's Supper, as most of us probably would, right? We don't enjoy fencing people off from the table. We want people to be saved, to give testimony of conversion, and be able to come to the table. But Solomon Stoddard ends up taking a position here that as long as you're baptized and you're living a non-scandalous life, even if you haven't had the most excellent ability to profess your faith before the elders and join the church, you should still be able to come to the Lord's table. Essentially, he will argue that because communion itself might help to convert you. And so he begins to use this language of the Lord's Supper is a converting ordinance. So rather than suggesting, as most of the Reformed would, that you must already be converted to participate in the Lord's Supper, I would hold that position, by the way. You must be converted to participate in the Lord's Supper, as well as baptized and be a church member. Solomon Stoddard would say, more broadly, as long as you're not living a scandalous life, you can come. You might actually get saved in the participation of the Holy Meal. Now, Edwards will go along with this. They're co-pastors for a couple of years. Edwards co-pastoring with his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, between 1727 and 1729. And when Stoddard dies, Edwards is going to work hard to revert back to the more stringent position related to the Lord's Supper. Okay. Now, this communion deal is not going to go without controversy. And here's where he's going to get into a major pamphlet war with the Mathers family back in Boston. Okay. So he's going to be writing back and forth against the Mathers. They're going to be writing pamphlets back and forth against him. And he makes this change again because he's concerned that if we don't open up the Lord's Supper, first of all, the church is going to die out. Okay, so we're not going to have a church in a few years if we don't, find a way to get these people integrated into the life of the church. Few were presenting themselves for communion. Fewer and fewer wanted to go before the elders to give their testimony because, again, ostensibly it was too strict as to how you had to verbalize your testimony of saving grace. And not only that, but Stoddard was concerned that even if they're able to verbally articulate, you still don't know whether or not they're really saved. Maybe they're saying the words right and they're giving their testimony in the proper order. And then again, you might actually be preventing people who are saved from coming to the table. So he would say, it's better to just open up that table more broadly and allow the Lord to work in people's lives, even if God uses communion itself to convert those people. There might have been, though, remember I said he was a bit of an elitist, some concern that if he wasn't permitting people to the table, then he couldn't withhold people from the table. Notice that distinction there. Stoddard obviously enjoys his broad influence over the town and the community at large. And again, you could use, now this is to think really malevolently here, okay? I'm not suggesting this was the actual motive, but certainly he was probably accused of this. If you don't permit people to come to the table, then you can't hold them back from the table either. And you certainly don't want people to be disinterested in the table. And so some might suggest that all of this was a way to maintain pastoral control. And again, that's a bit of a dark view, but I'm just letting you know that that view is out there. Okay, so here would be some concerns with Stoddard's position on the Lord's table. First of all, it does seem pretty clear, and I would hold this, that 1 Corinthians 11, 27 to 32 argues that you should be able to examine yourself in the faith, making sure that you can discern the Lord's body and that you can come to the table and do so in a worthy manner. Second of all, this idea that it's a converting ordinance doesn't seem to be what the Bible suggests as the purpose of the Lord's table. As we understand it in the Reformed tradition, the Lord's table is a sacrament by which the gracious covenant of Christ is signified and sealed to us. It doesn't seem to be purposed to convert us, okay? It does also, his position, I think, blur the distinction between the town and the church. Again, Solomon Stoddard basically wanted everybody in the town to participate in church and to come to the table. But that also kind of blurs the distinction between the invisible church and the secular or the unbelieving world. And unfortunately, what this did do, and we kind of know this, well, factually, it led the way to an open table communion policy, which ended up being broadly adopted in many, many, many churches today, and probably some of yours that are even listening here, in which there are no standards to come to the Lord's table. So we call that open communion. Now, Stoddard technically was not an open communionist. Again, he suggested that people did have to be baptized and they did have to have a scandal-free life. But once you sort of open the floodgates there, the next domino to fall is open communion, wherein you don't have to even be baptized and you don't have to live a non-scandalous life. Basically, anybody comes to the table and there's nobody there to check you In fact, the whole concept of fencing the table to prevent people from coming in an unworthy manner is completely disestablished. And so that would be some concerns with Solomon Stoddard's position here. Now let's go back to his relationship to Jonathan Edwards. We've alluded to it a couple of times already. This is how it happened. This is how it came to be. Edwards was called to assist his grandfather in 1726. Why was he called as an assistant or associate pastor? Well, because Solomon Stoddard, although he was sharp to the very end of his life, his mind was sharp, yet he was in his 80s and his body began to fail, as all of our bodies eventually will fail, no question about that. So Stoddard needs an assistant, and in order to call somebody to be helpful to him, but probably also to maintain family strength, okay? Remember, Connecticut River gods. He wants somebody who's in the family that would be loyal to the family, and so he selects then Jonathan Edwards, his grandson, which by this time is already showing excellent prowess intellectually and a ton of promise theologically and pastorally. So in 1727, Jonathan Edwards is going to be ordained, and shortly thereafter, he will also marry his bride, Sarah. And they're going to enjoy about 2-3 years of co-pastorate, 1727 to 1729, at which point Solomon Stoddard is going to die, and Jonathan Edwards will become the sole or solo pastor of the Northampton church. All the while, Edwards' own conscience is very, very bothered by his grandfather's communion policy, and so Edwards is going to have this internal spiritual war in his own heart between honoring his grandfather. He's the wise, tall, strong intellect, the Connecticut River god that you couldn't challenge. But meanwhile, Edwards actually believes his own father, Timothy Edwards, his position is right. Timothy has a far more restrictive policy about who can come to the Lord's table. And Timothy probably even goes too far in the other direction, because at one point, and this is an interesting fact, Timothy Edwards, because his congregation was fighting and gossiping too much, he barred the whole church from the table for, I think it was like 2 years. And he had to have the Hampshire Association end up getting involved to help mitigate that controversy. Whereas Stoddard wanted to open the table to practically anybody, Timothy Edwards would like close it off to everybody. And Jonathan Edwards has a middle ground position, but he definitely, you know, it's interesting in Marsden's biography, Edwards will almost never really depart from his father's positions on a lot of things. There's a couple things. His morphology of conversion, Timothy Edwards would hold to those rigorous series of steps in articulating your faith. Edwards doesn't buy that. He's going to do something different in his distinguishing marks of the work of the Spirit, and especially in his religious affections. He's going to talk about different ways to identify, or at least help to identify, who is saved and who is not. Timothy held to that rigorous Perkinsian, William Perkins's understanding of the morphology of the steps of conversion. Edwards doesn't quite go that direction. But at least as far as the communion controversy goes, Jonathan Edwards is going to hold more to a Timothy Edwards type policy rather than a Solomon Stoddard type policy here. Now, here's another reason to like Solomon Stoddard, and that is that as a pastor, he was very concerned with revivals and revivalism. There are at least 5 what we might call revivals or harvests, he called them, or Edwards would call them awakenings during Stoddard's pastorate. 1680, 1684, 1697, 1713, and 1719. These are all significant times in which people are getting saved and coming into the life of the church. This is wonderful. Would that every pastor has at least one time of awakening or revival in the midst of their pastorate. Solomon Stoddard had 5. And there's kind of another one here in 1729. This is the year that Stoddard dies. There's an earthquake in Northampton, and once again we saw sort of a crying out of the people for renewed power in their relationship with God as it relates to conversion and dependence upon Him. Edwards, of course, is going to go on to be the revivalist par excellence of this particular period. But one of the reasons Edwards came to love revivals and awakenings was because his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, was, we can't say successful because revival is the work of the Spirit, But certainly by means of the ordinary means of grace in Solomon Stoddard's preaching, he did happen to enjoy at least 5 significant revivals in that particular area. Now, as it relates to Stoddard's views on preaching, here is something very interesting. Stoddard would advocate that we study the text very hard, but that we come into the pulpit with no manuscript or notes. Okay, now Edwards could never do this. He wanted to try, but Edwards, as much as he tried to get away from notes, he couldn't do it. Stoddard did not believe in manuscripts or notes. He would study the text, he would pray, he would prepare, and then he would come into the pulpit and he would deliver. He would deliver and he would preach hard on the gospel, hard on judgment. He would preach hard on hell and judgment and rebuke moral error and laxity that he saw in the town. And if you're wondering why he preached hell so vehemently, Solomon Stoddard actually argues, I think convincingly, that preaching hell is an act of compassion, because you are eventually and hopefully trying to spare people from the reality of hell by preaching it to them. And so he would say that he was acting very compassionately and indeed morally and mercifully by warning his people of the fires of hell, a position that, by the way, I would agree with. Okay, so Stoddard is a no-notes, fiery preacher, but nobody could ever argue that because he didn't use notes, his sermons were sloppily prepared. He just happened to have one of those sharp minds in which he didn't need it, and manuscripts or notes would be a distraction to him and an artificial imposition of the preaching moment rather than something that would be helpful. And again, there's something that Jonathan would probably disagree with. Here's a quote from John Erskine. I found this in Beakey, again citing my sources here. His sermons were searching and experimental. Now experimental doesn't mean like science lab. We're talking about heartfelt is the idea there. Yet rational and argumentative and often peculiarly, I can't say that word, peculiarly, there you go, suited for awakening the secure, directing the great work of salvation, and assisting the doubtful in judging their spiritual state. Okay, there's Erskine's assessment of Solomon Stoddard's preaching. Here's another thing that I think is pretty cool. He was very passionate about Native American missions. In fact, he rebuked many of the colonists if he thought that they were using or taking advantage of the Native Americans. He wanted them to be converted. He rebuked, again, those that he would see as using them or manipulating them in any way. He said, and this is a quote here, that Indians are of mankind and so objects of God's merciful compassion. And he wrote on this in a number of places, including his 1723 tract. Tracts weren't these little flimsy gospel pamphlets, but they were something more like a treatise that was published. His tract questioned whether God is not angry with the county or the country for not doing more to the conversion of the Indians. Sometimes, whenever hardships would befall the people, they would look to reasons why God might be smiting a particular area, and Stoddard often posited that God was smiting the region because of their maltreatment of the Native Americans or the Indians or the First Peoples, whatever term you prefer to use. I'll go with Native Americans today. Amongst his major writings, there was The Efficacy of the Fear of Hell, 1712. This one a little bit more notable, A Guide to Christ, and then finally his Treatise on Conversion, 1719. Now his A Guide to Christ is probably one of his more noteworthy pieces, and this is interesting because notice who wrote the foreword, Increase Mather, 1714. And that's kind of something helpful to bring our story all the way around to the beginning again, because remember his tension with the Mathers? Well, at least here, he finds himself reunited with the Mathers, so much so that Increase ends up writing the introduction to his book. So I think at the end of the day, though they had their theological tensions and argumentations and their polemical pamphlet wars, at the end of the day, they all knew that they were on the same page, which was to preach Christ, incite people to repent of their sins, and do the work of evangelism. So we can praise God for that. Now, he dies at the age of 85, still in the pulpit. He even had sermons prepared to preach, which he did not eventually preach. Again, he worked hard studying the text. He was ready to go on a bunch of sermons. He did not have the time to eventually preach them because his own time ran out. To the very end, his mind was as sharp as a razor, though his eyes began to fail. And towards the end of his life, the young people began to lose a little esteem for him. And it was reported that some of the young people would be mocking, teasing, or even joking during church because Solomon Stoddard couldn't see them anymore. And unfortunately, that's what happened. His last ruling elder died the same day he did, which again we think is unfortunate because we believe in ruling elders, especially as Presbyterians. And he was eulogized with the phrase, "A mighty tree has fallen in the forest." And indeed, his influence was quite outstanding. Now let's wrap up here with a little bit of his legacy, and then we'll be done. First of all, long pastorates. We're talking 60 years in the same church. Praise God for that, right? I mean, it seems so often that pastors can stick it out for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and they quit, move on, move out, dry up, burn out from the ministry. But man, in these days, some of these stalwarts, they would spend decades in the same pulpit without tiring or getting weak. Solomon Stoddard, 60 years in the pulpit. Secondly, we could say that his influence in society for Christ was largely positive. Now, again, we could critique what ended up being called Stoddardism or the open communionism, which was probably a net loss in his legacy. But for the most part, he influenced his time, his day, for the sake of Christ in a positive direction, no question about that. He strongly encouraged ministers to meet together for the sake of accountability, friendship, and fellowship, and thus he formed the Hampshire Association to his credit. He boldly preached on heaven and hell, and we can thank him for that. And he did give us a very positive example of reconciliation with one's intellectual opponents, i.e. the Mathers family. Just because we disagree, even vehemently so, on certain topics does not mean that we need to cut them out of our lives or have irreconcilable relationships with them. And so Stoddard, we can say he did all of that well. Well, that's it for Solomon Stoddard. If I got anything wrong or you want to add anything or correct me or supplement to this, please feel free to do so in the comment section of this video. Once again, let me issue an invitation to come study Jonathan Edwards with me. January here of 2025, January 24 and 25, we're going to be doing a Jonathan Edwards class. It is a 1-credit class. If you're interested, you can also audit it or simply take the class for no credit if you're not interested in doing that. And if you like my stuff on Edwards and Edwards-related topics, you might want to check out my book, A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity, which is available on Amazon.com, link in the description. All right. Well, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for checking in. I love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.